delighted on this episode to be talking with author, creator Alisa Kwitney. Alisa, you have been a teacher. You've worked with students that have been working through dyslexia. You have written prose, books like Flirting in Cars, as well as comics in the world of Sandman and Batgirl, Mystic You. Rogue Untouched prose novel, and now we're talking about a book called HOWL. So you have a range of experiences, is the short version of what I just said.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I learned early on in my career is that the one of the best things you can do to build your author platform is to pick a lane and sort of stick to it, or at least have, a definitive identity. And I have failed in this because I am a multiple personality author.
I completely get that, and I tend to appreciate writers that work across spaces. So that's one of the things I think that appeals to me about your work. What led you to this world of writing?
Well, I think Howl, which is my latest comic book series from Ahoy, is kind of the answer to that because I was raised by writers. I was
Mhm.
my mom was a writer who worked more in nonfiction and journalism and essay form, and my father was the science fiction writer Robert Sheckley. And so he actually didn't raise me because he was gone for most of my childhood, which is not what the series is about. Um, but his bookshelf raised me, and my mom raised me to, I don't know, to read, to think about words, um, to think about storytelling.
No, I know that there are personal stories that have inspired the book, and you mentioned that you were raised by a bookshelf. So I'm curious about some of the names that would be on that bookshelf. And I'm recognizing that I'm wearing Darth Vader here. You have alien earrings, so I think we're talking about science fiction. Um, so curious about who some of those people might be that inspired you early on.
Sure. So my father, when he left for Europe. And so he left his 1947 Martin guitar and, the books, which were his books and his compatriots. So, Theodore Sturgeon and Harlan Ellison and Asimov and Heinlein, Frederick Brown, uh, Zena Henderson. And so I think because a lot of these were done as short stories, they were so accessible to me. It was,
Mhm.
you could dip in, and it was, for people who haven't tried reading these kind of short stories, it was like reading episodes of classic Twilight Zone.
Truly, truly. In fact, a lot of episodes were adapted from short stories, so that totally tracks.
And
Uh,
according to my mother, stolen. But I
I'm
don't
sure.
know what, she's not around. She did say um, that Sterling had a little bit of a reputation among writers, but it might have been sour grapes. I do not know.
Yeah, yeah. We'll let them sort of sort that out in the writers' room beyond, I suppose. Now, talking comics, since we're talking HAL, which is comics graphic novel based, and as I mentioned, you worked in the worlds of Batgirl and Sandman, Vertigo, and been an editor, I believe, in comic spaces as well. What are some things that you keep in mind when moving from prose to a comic script?
Oh, such a good question. So first of all, I was an editor. At first, I started out as Karen Berger's assistant editor. Before Vertigo had its official launch, it was at that point it was just Karen Berger likes all these weird fantasy, dark, a lot of British guys.
Hmm.
And that resonated because I grew up loving comics, particularly horror comics, a lot of DC horror comics. Um, and okay, so I worked there on staff for about 7 years, and it was this huge education for me. I got to talk with people like Paul Levitz and Denny O'Neill, who gave classes in storytelling. And I had already gotten my MFA from Columbia in fiction. So there were things that I knew about prose and about storytelling from the literary approach. But, Paul Levitz and Denny O'Neil started to talk about, you know, the A, B, and C plotting of an ongoing series and, limp in an eye patch and visual storytelling techniques. Um, I can describe what those are if you want me to go back to those. So I've tried as much as possible to keep going back and forth between prose and comics because they strengthen different muscles. One of the keys
Hmm.
to um, really effective storytelling in comics is that what you see tells one story, and the words, the text, and the dialogue tell either something that enhances it or contradicts it. You don't want to say, Fluffy was the cutest little kitten in the world and see a picture of a cute little kitten. You want, Fluffy was the seventh most powerful, Archduke of Hell and a picture of a cute little kitten. So
Hmm.
keeping a story moving kind of in counterpoint to me is one of the key things with comics. And because I don't draw very well, the second part is that I'm dancing with someone else. And you don't want to try and schlep someone around a dance floor. You want to be
Hmm.
in a give and take with them. So I think the more I've learned about how to collaborate effectively, the better my comics have gotten. And by I mean our, with Mauricet, the artist I've been working with a lot, or whoever I'm
Hmm.
working. So prose works a little differently. And I went to this wonderful Parnassus secondhand bookstore in Cape Cod, and I found this old mystery writer's how-to handbook with an essay by John D. MacDonald. And John D is just like one of the great pulpy literary. I mean, his stuff is as good as literature, but it's genre, it's mystery,
Hmm.
crime stuff. So when he talks about prose, he talks about how do you get at stuff, and how do you achieve this technique of making the person believe that the character they're reading about is a fully rounded real person, not just someone that you've plunked down like a monopoly piece to move them through their paces.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
there's a lot more of interiority and how you're filtering what is perceived through the consciousness of a character.
Yeah, yeah,
Any
getting
word
inside of that mind.
that.
Yeah, digging into that perspective, right?
Yeah, and being very, very selective. Okay, in Cape Cod, I also got to go to Edward Gorey's house there. And
Hmm.
the guy
Nice.
giving the talk said that Gorey in the army had studied Japanese art, and it really taught him what to leave out. So for people who may not be as familiar, everyone knows who Ed Gorey is, right? I shouldn't, do I need to say? Those are those spooky Addams Family cartoons of sort of gothic characters with a very macabre sense of humor. And they look like they could have been created somewhere between 1815 and 1930, but he actually only died pretty recently, and was working in the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
And we'll put an image up of some of that work so that the uninitiated can check it out as well. Now, going back to the dancing partner question, you mentioned Morrissey. So, what was it like to collaborate with Morrissey? And any shout outs to the rest of the creative, the editorial team?
Oh, yeah. Okay, so Moise, his real name is Alain. Moise is sort of his pen name. He and I started working together, I think it's been 10 years now. And we were paired up for the first iteration of Mystic U, which was a supernatural DC Comics series. Um, and that project sort of died and then got reborn. And the wonderful Mike Norton ended up doing it with me, but Alan and I got into a conversation that kind of kept going. What should we do together? How should we work together? And the more we talked and the more we I think the first thing we'd been already talking for a few years when we finally did an Edgar Allan Poe something for Edgar Allan, The Snifter of Terror, which were my, writers' riffs on Edgar Allan Poe. And mine was
Hmm.
which was a very dentata kind of tale. And so by that point, I knew things about how Alan's mind works, Mauricet's mind works. So just as I do with characters in a book, where I'm thinking, okay, you know, you're 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 Quasimodo, and and you're used to the bells. So when you're here, how would you perceive this? So I don't mean to compare Mauricet with Quasimodo, but I would try to see the story through his eyes. So as I'm breaking down my panel descriptions and as I'm um, imagining things, I'm imagining it with his pictures. So, for example, in the Edgar Allan Poe, which was a motif of teeth, there's a canopy bed, and I wanted the ripples of the canopy to suggest teeth. And I began to work in teeth everywhere, knowing that, Morrissey would just find this really delicious and have a lot of fun with it. I've had other artists just, I think I had one artist say, "Yeah, I'd rather not work with you. You don't put in enough fight scenes." And and I was so glad to have that artist, who's a really great artist, recuse themselves from a project because, if what you really want is major, major fisticuffs all the time, I'm not going to give you your best pleasures. But with Alan,
Hmm.
we love body horror, we love humor, we love weird reaction shots, we love moving back and forth between the scary and the funny and the just plain, gross out. So, yeah, so that, it's been a relationship. It's like playing musical instruments together. You get better and better until, I guess, well, rock, my mother used to say most marriages and rock bands are not destined to live forever together because they, but no, Alan and I are doing very well.
Wonderful. I love what you're saying there about the visual motifs too. Going back to that comics and prose question, you can certainly sprinkle in the motif in a novel, but getting those images and highlights, it definitely makes comics worth the reread.
Yes, when I was teaching symbolism, I remember saying, the difference between a metaphor, a simile, and a symbol is you can instantly doodle a symbol.
Mhm. Mhm. You mentioned that tonal balance, moving from the frightening, the unexpected, to the humorous. Uh, how do you go about achieving that on the writing side?
In comics or in prose? In comics?
Since we're talking how, we can tackle comics specifically, and if there are any nods that you'd like to give to prose, that's also more than welcome.
So, it's laughter is a startle reflex, which people forget. And sometimes writers will revert to what I call the joke-shaped object. It's got the
Mhm.
rhythm of a joke, but if it was ever unexpected, that was back in 1935, and we've all seen this a lot. And so it no longer works as actual humor. So to be funny, something has to break up a pattern, break up a rhythm. And there's that old joke about, what makes a joke timing. you know, very important to have the timing of when something comes in. So for an artist and a writer to be funny together, I think really requires it's that is where that you're truly in sync. And it took me a long time to understand the spatial aspect of comics. Some people, like Neil Gaiman, I remember always was really good about figuring out where the ad flats were, and you'd have, page, turn, reveal. And
Hmm.
I don't think anyone had to teach him that explicitly. Me, I needed someone to explicitly say, well, where are the ads going to fall? Have you just, you put a double page spread where a double page spread cannot be because there will be a big ad for, Wrigley's chewing gum.
Hmm. All the mechanics of the profession as well.
Yeah.
Thinking about certainly your background as a reader, what does science fiction allow you to do? What has it allowed you to explore in your storytelling? Because not everything that you have is science fiction. You also have sort of multicultural romance and some of those pieces that are part of your oeuvre as well.
Yeah, I think, at the beginning of this, I was saying that I am sort of a possessed multi-personality writer. I do think that when, people have actually gone into the books, whatever it is I've written, you can see, um, they're not as different as they might look on the surface, because I'm interested a lot in how people work. And
Mhm.
I think that, I've friends who are scientists, and, really they read science fiction for the science, and they love that Andy Weir aspect of, well, if you're growing potatoes on Mars and you've got this much sunshine and you've got this, and I can enjoy an Andy Weir novel and film with the best of them, but I'm interested in how people work, and I'm interested in how groups of people work. So when I wasn't studying English, I studied a lot of psychology and sociology. And so there is a branch of science fiction that is really more satire and sociology, and occasionally, psychology thrown in there, than it is actual, how the machine and the potatoes would grow in that much light, but the thing came on. And I think Twilight Zone is that kind of, well, Twilight Zone also kind of goes between science fiction and horror. So, see, I mean, the my father, as a science fiction writer, wrote absurdist comedies that were very much about, um, you know, iconoclastic, quirky individuals in a society that was determined to make them conform to some other standard of being. And sometimes it was, society 100 or 1,000 years in the future, and sometimes it was some alien culture. But that really resonated for me. The question of, stepping back a little and seeing the absurdity of how we do things the way we do. But my
Yeah.
father was also, I mean, he was so smart and so funny and so humble about it. He had this wonderful trick, which is you could talk to him and he would plant these seeds so that you felt as though you understood more than you had come into the conversation without. It was kind of like someone slipping you a note under the desk, and you're like, oh yeah, okay, now I can use Montaigne, even though I've never read Montaigne before. And he was wonderful in all those ways. And he was just, just kind of a desperately bad husband and father, even by the standards of the late 50s, early 60s. So, he always had this sort of baffled, well, what could I do? I was married to these women and they wanted to have children. And there it was. And then the marriage dissolved. And I, found myself on an island in the Balearic Sea. And, and suddenly I was living another life with another wife and another set of children. Life's so
Mhm.
strange. And, that hapless protagonist that I found endearing in his science fiction was also something to contend with, as an absence of a father. My half
Yeah.
sister called me up to kind of, we wished each other happy Fatherless Day for Father's Day. Um, so even though I've written in different genres, to write about my parents, the early years of their relationship, they lived together before they were married at a time when, that was a very outre beatnik thing to do. Uh,
Mhm.
it it yearned to be science fiction, and I think that it yearned it the story material I thought would be funnier and truer in a way if I explored the whole idea of pod people. And
Mhm.
the idea, for those who, Jack Finney, his book, The Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which uh, became a 1956 movie and then a 1978 movie. I think there's a more recent one as well. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think there was like a 2007, I want to say, or something like that.
The 1978 one is my Invasion of the Body Snatchers. But the thing that interests me about it is that underneath that trope, there's this scary idea. How how is it that people who seem so familiar, who look and sound like the people that you've lived with and slept next to, how can they turn so alien so quickly?
Mhm.
And there's
Mhm.
different ways to get at that. So one, of course, is pod people. The other is zombies. I just finished reading Clay McLeod Chapman's Wake Up and Open Your Eyes, which is a wonderful political of the moment zombie tale. But for me, I thought, okay, my dad was a science fiction writer. They belonged to the science fiction world in Greenwich Village in the 50s. They went to the meetings of Hydra, which was the Science Fiction Association's group's name before it became, a Marvel supervillain group.
Mhm.
Uh,
Mhm.
so I thought, okay, this needs to be science fiction. But of course, it's science fiction. It's for those who, I have many friends who would be deeply disappointed by my lack of attention to technical detail. So,
Well, I appreciate all that you shared there and the rich history and uh, the way that you reflect on all of that and find your voice in it. So just sending appreciation for that as well.
thank you.
Yeah. I have one more question on the list. Do we have anything that I've not mentioned so far that you want to make sure to include before we get there? I always like to ask.
I'm trying to think what else. I I I always come sort of ready to riff. I'm not sure I came with enough of um just that, I think it's a lot of fun to go on a deep dive if people read HOWL and if they enjoy it. I would invite them to take a look at my influences. So first of all, you can look up some of my mom's essays. She wrote really funny and wise articles for Cosmopolitan magazine, but she may be harder to find than my dad's short stories. I really suggest everyone should read Warm, which is the story that my mom read as a high school student before she met my dad. Should have been a warning, let me tell you right there. But uh, other than that, though, besides Invasion of the Body Snatchers, I thought a lot about John Carpenter has two films. One is The Thing, which a lot of people now know as this wonderful protean shape-shifting monster in the Arctic. And Rob Bottin, I think, is the special effects guy. He was just a kid when he was doing these amazing and sometimes dangerous special effects. And I am one of those people like, look up the old physical special effects. You will renounce your CGI.
True,
But
true.
he also in just about the same time period, John Carpenter did a movie called Starman, which is a very different
Mhm.
look at a shape-shifting alien, which is romantic and has a very young Jeff Bridges. And I think everyone who has ever seen that movie, says, I have watched you very carefully, green light go, yellow light go faster. So I think those two sides, people talk a lot about Spielberg's two sides with E.T. and Poltergeist, these, light and dark versions of his psyche. But I don't hear as much about the John Carpenter. So anyway, Yes. So watch Invasion of the Body Snatchers, read Warm, and watch John Carpenter movies.
I love that there's a reading list. Love that. And of course, we'll add HOWL to that. So, anywhere that people can go to check out the issues, the book, and anything that you'd like to say about what's next for you.
Sure. Oh, and I should mention that if people enjoy it, Maurice and I did Guilt, the Guild of Independent Lady Temporalists, about a woman in her 80s who goes time traveling back to the mid 70s in New York City, and it's kind of a Freaky Friday seven. If you're a fan of 1970s New York and cinema, that one's fun too. Um, I'm working on a bunch of things right now in both comics and prose. So I don't have anything that's coming out the next moment, but I'm putting together a newsletter so I can talk about my influences as I marinate and create.
Love it, love it. Well, many, many thanks. And in terms of finding the book, finding HAL, any spaces online that you'd like to mention, social media spaces or anything like that where people can follow along?
Oh, sure. I mean, HOWL is, through Comixology and Amazon. I think it's Simon and Schuster for individual issues, but it's being collected as a trade, and there's going to be some really nice extras, including, a letter of my father's talking about, sitting in Harlan Ellison's hotel room as they try and pitch things to various people, and we believe it's the mid 60s.
Lisa, many thanks. Many thanks for the conversation. Certainly glad to have you back anytime. And thank you for exploring your personal history and literature with me.
Oh, thank you. This was a fun conversation, and yeah, so well, I hope to talk to you again with the next project.